Welcome to the Leadership Passport podcast, where we dive into the journeys, challenges, and insights of school and education leaders from around the world. And I'm delighted to introduce my guest today, Kai Vacher. So I'm going to stop there, Kai. Have I pronounced your last name correctly?
I wonder how many times I've been asked that. One of the joys of coming to this part of the world 14 years ago is that quite often, actually, people just go straight to my first name and call me Mr. Kai, which makes my life a lot easier. But if you think of Basher Vasher, not that you should associate me with bashing, but that's how you can say it, Vasher. But my dad would say Vacher, but that seems to cause even more confusion. So normally I say Vasher, but if we're in the Middle East, you can call me Mr. Kai, which is great.
All right. Well, Mr. Kai sounds fine with me. So let me give you a formal introduction, and then we'll continue our conversation. So, Mr. Kai, with 25 years' experience in the UK state sector, became principal of the British School of Muscat in 2011 and extended his leadership to the British School Salalah in 2019. His tenure is defined by a commitment to excellence and innovation, inspired by students, staff, and both communities. Under his guidance, BSM has earned global recognition, including ranking among the world's top 100 schools and the Middle East's top 10 for 4 consecutive years. Serves on the COBA's board of directors, presents BSME, and was named a top international education influencer in 2021, 22, and 24. He also hosts the Educators Corner podcast. Welcome, Kai.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks for inviting me onto your show. It's a pleasure and it's a privilege to be talking with you here today.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. And look, you shared with me a little bit earlier some interesting times you had hosting the SSAT annual conference back in the UK. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Okay, well, that was quite a key point in my leadership journey because from probably about the age of 10, I had a really bad stammer at times. So if you take my first day at school, secondary school, I couldn't say my surname for about 5 minutes when the teachers, as we went from class to class, they said, well, how do you pronounce this name? And I just couldn't say it. So I got off to a really bad start in terms of how I felt in terms of my secondary education. Felt very embarrassed. You know, when you're trying to impress your mates around you and you can't even say your name, makes you feel a bit stupid. So if you sort of fast forward to about 20 years after that, I'm, I guess, in my mid to late 30s, and I'm working for SSAT, and I've already been a teacher and done some school leadership for about 15 years, but I wasn't high on confidence at that point in my career. And I had this fantastic leader called Sue Williamson. And she was fantastic for lots of reasons. But for me personally, at that point, she believed in me when I probably didn't believe in myself as much as I could have done. And I was still stuttering quite a bit then. I was still terrified of speaking in public. And I was still had this sort of trauma when anybody asked me to say my name, you know, when you introduce yourself at a meeting or a workshop, say, right, so what's your name? And it's, oh no. And that took me back to that first day of secondary school when I couldn't say my name. Anyway, Sue said to me one day, she said, you're going to lead and MC the SSAT National Conference, and there's going to be no stammering. And I looked at her in disbelief, and she said, yeah, you are. You're going to do it, and you're going to do a really good job. And that was a defining moment because I was absolutely terrified. But having Sue believe in me at that point made a huge difference. And I was really excited as well. I was terrified, but I was, also really excited because I was going to be creating this 3-day event at the International Convention Centre in Birmingham. And we would typically attract over 2,000 school leaders from the UK and also from around the world, from over 1,000 schools for 3 days. And I would be on stage and I'd be introducing people like Sir Tony Blair, Sir Bob Geldof, Sir Ken Robinson, Dame Stella Rimington. She was head of MI5 quite a few years ago, Karen Brady. And yes, there's some really big names from the political world, the education world, the business world. And yeah, I did stammer a bit, but knowing that I had her backing and her belief made a huge difference. And I did take some workshops and some lessons in public speaking during that time. And I guess that sort of practice, the training, and then actually just being pushed right outside of my comfort zone onto this main stage, and it is terrifying. And even those big names I mentioned, they're all terrified too. When you're waiting to introduce them backstage, you have a green room in big auditoriums like that, and there's different reasons about why it's called a green room. People have got different views on that, but one of the explanations of why it's called the green room is because you're green with sickness before you go on. And so without betraying too many competencies, but if you think of some of the biggest names in public speaking, they are also terrified before they go on stage, and I've been standing next to them. So it is terrifying, but her belief in me at that point and pushing me into that space and giving me that experience over 5 years, I did that. That gave me so much confidence, and it really then gave me the belief that if I can speak on the main stage at this conference, then I'm going to be able to do school assemblies. I can be a head teacher. I can do that. And that was one of the big things that up until that point was holding me back from being a school leader. So, yeah, it was a defining moment, that moment when she said, you're going to lead the SSAT annual conference.
Yeah, amazing. What a great story. Fantastic. You would have met some amazing people as well, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, met some amazing people. I mean, I think one of the best moments across that 5 years, and it was also always a great creative opportunity to think about how we would energize, inspire, and enthuse this audience of school leaders. But I think one of the best moments was when I worked with somebody called Gareth Malone, who's quite a big name now in the UK, and he's worked on a number of BBC productions where he gets different groups of people to sing, and we fortunately identified him as somebody we could work with when he was just about to hit the big time. He wasn't quite the big name he is now. And with Gareth, we sort of hatched this idea that during the week of the conference, we'd get a group of year 6 students, a class of year 6 students, a class of year 10 students, and a class from a special school. And we'd get these students together and they would co-construct a song with Gareth, and that they would perform that song on the final night of the conference. And we were really trying to put across this whole point of sort of student leadership and student involvement in learning. And, what can you do when you get groups of students together? What can you create together? And what Gareth created with those groups of students in Birmingham was such a magic moment on that stage at the final evening of the conference, where you got these students singing together, and they'd got to know each other over these few days that they'd worked together. The special school kids, the year 6 kids, the year 10 kids, and they were holding each other's hands and they were singing together. And the song that they created, first of all, it was something they co-constructed together, but then towards the end, it morphed into take that song, Shine. I don't know if you know that song. And that was the sort of the rousing chorus and the audience reaction. I mean, it would have created a lot of emotion in Wembley or anything like that. I mean, it was a fantastic moment where you had this auditorium full of 2,000 school leaders, just like in tears and so much joy, watching these children, this group of children who never worked together, working with Gareth to create this music and this sound and this singing. It was such a beautiful moment. Absolutely, real power of education moment.
Yeah, fantastic. So if we continue that thread of music and performance, if your leadership style was a song or a movie, what would it be and why?
Well, I think I've got far too many songs in my head to sort of identify one song. But if we talk about films, Um, I think I'd have to go for the Shawshank Redemption. Maybe that it's very often comes out the top of these sorts of charts when you ask that question. But why the Shawshank Redemption? Because I think the central theme of hope that runs through that film. I mean, do you know the film, Kevin?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, poor Andy and Red. Andy goes through so much diversity. You just there's so many points to that film where you think he just can't take any more, and it's like it's a bad day at school followed by another bad day at school followed by, and I think as leaders and I think as teachers, teaching is a tough job, but it's highly rewarding. Being a school leader is a tough job. Quite a lot of the time, it's really tough, but it's also highly rewarding, and I think, as school leaders and as teachers, I think we have to be hopeful for our students, for our colleagues, for our community, for the world. And I think that message of hope against the most incredible diversity and the way that film ends. I mean, I can watch the last few minutes of that film again and again and again, and it still causes emotion in me. I just think that message of hope that permeates through that film is just so powerful, and I think it's just a wonderful, wonderful, piece of art that's created such a powerful message.
It's such a powerful movie, to be sure. I agree with you. If we talk a little bit now about your leadership journey, and you talked before about your work in the UK and as a teacher and as a leader in that system, what inspired you to take the leap and move into international education and leadership?
Yeah, that's a good question. Towards the end of my time at SSAT, so we're now talking about 2010, 2011, I've been out of school for 8 or 9 years, and I loved my job at the SSAT, absolutely loved it. But I also was doing a job where day in, day out, I was trying to persuade, inspire, support teachers and school leaders to be innovative and do things differently. And at that point in my career, having not actually been a head teacher or a principal myself, I did feel, as the years went by, more and more vulnerable and maybe a bit of a fraud, because I couldn't say, when I was a head, I'd done this, and why don't you try that, or I experienced this. Whilst I loved my job, I thought by the time we were getting sort of 2010, 11, it was time for me to dip my toe back into school. And by that point, really because of the work I'd done with Sue and a number of other people I'd worked with, I'd gained a lot in confidence, and I did feel ready to lead a school. But what I didn't feel completely comfortable with was the idea of leading a school in the state sector in the UK, which up until that point, I'd spent my whole career in the state sector in the UK. And for a long time, I thought about the international sector, and I was always too scared. You can always find a reason not to go and make the leap internationally. But it got to 2010, and I thought, well, if I don't make that leap now, it's going to be too late. I'm never going to be able to make that leap. And I started looking around for jobs, as you do, and I was contacted about this job at British School Muscat. And I just reminded myself where Amman was on the map. And I later found out, much, much later, years later, I found out that I was there to make up the numbers because they only had 3 candidates in the final pool. They needed a 4th. And so this guy, this head hunter, had sort of, I'll get Vacher, see if he wants to take a punt. And I guess I felt with the international sector, it just felt like some of the concerns I had about being a leader in the state system in the UK. I was concerned about I do like data, but the way that data seemed to drive so many school decisions around about that point, the way that Ofsted was going, it just didn't feel comfortable for me to lead a school there. There were just too many things that I was not going to be happy with. And so when this opportunity came up to lead a school in British School Muscat, and the board recognised the value of my 9 years out of school, rather than seeing it as a hindrance, which I think some boards in the UK were doing when I was applying for jobs at that point. I thought, well, yeah, Muscat seems like a great place to be and to live. And I think I did sense that this school did have a huge amount of potential, and it was a lovely, lovely school, and it still is. But it had a lot of potential to be a lot better than it was. And when I was offered the job, that was probably one of the most joyful moments in my career, I think.
Amazing. And, you work across different cultures and you work with COBIS and other organizations. What's been your biggest aha moment in leading schools and working in education across different cultures?
I'm not sure if there's like one big aha moment, but I think I've had a number of them. I mean, when I was at the Specialist Schools Academies Trust, SSAT, I mean, I was doing a lot of work on teaching and learning, and in particular, trying to help schools think about how they personalize learning. This is before AI, back in the noughties. And so I was very, very passionate about teaching and learning, and I got to work with people like Professor Dylan William, Professor Guy Claxton, David Hargreaves, and we were thinking about leadership, but we also did a lot of work on pedagogy and classroom practice. And so naively, when I started being a school leader here in Muscat, I thought this was all about leading, teaching and learning. And obviously that is the core business of schooling. But the bit I guess I just didn't realize at that point is that when you're leading a school, and I guess I don't think it's just an international school, it's probably any school, how important the school community is to learning, to the thing I was really passionate about. And so I guess as I went through my leadership journey here, I think, the first cultural fair that we had back in 2011, and now it's an annual event when all our families come in. They come into school. We have 70 odd different nationalities here in British School Muscat, and each nationality, they come and they bring their food, and they share their culture, and they share that with the school community. The parents get so excited. They're so proud to do that. The kids absolutely love it. So moments like that. And then when we have our community iftar every year, when we have the school production, the music concerts, we have something called the Ali Al Habsi Cup, which is an annual football tournament for our community. It is the power and the emotion and the pride that you feel when the school community gets together. That's something that I just hadn't anticipated. And I guess that was brought home even more. I guess if there was one aha moment, it was quite negative, is when we went into COVID 5 years ago and we couldn't do those things for maybe a couple of years. And what, as a community, we felt that we'd lost. And that was so painful that when we didn't have those opportunities to come together and connect, parents, colleagues, students. So I guess I've really got to understand and value over the past 14 years that actually, if you really want successful teaching and learning in and outside the classroom, nurturing that community and that community feel is so important to a school.
Now, if we talk a little bit now about some of the realities of leadership, what's been one of the toughest leadership challenges you've faced, and how did you navigate it?
Well, I think without doubt, the toughest leadership challenge so far was the COVID period, from March 2020 through, the next sort of 18 months after that. I mean, that was really tough. I mean, yes, we lost that sense of community. We lost that connection with students, with colleagues, with our parents. The whole online learning piece, the financial pressure that was putting on the community. We all can remember that. Probably don't want to go back there. So how did I navigate that as a school leader? Well, it was tough. I mean, it was really tough, and I think for everybody it was tough right around the world. And I think I was reminded of something that Jim Collins talks about in his 2002 book, Good to Great, which has had a big influence on me as a school leader. And he talks about the Stockdale paradox. Don't know if you've come across that, Kevin. Okay. So the Stockdale paradox is named after a prisoner of war who I think was either in the Second World War or the Korean War, who was a prisoner of war, and he went through extreme hardship as a prisoner of war. And he noticed that those prisoners around him who let's say they were taken prisoner in the summer, and if they were being really optimistic and said, oh, we'll be out of here by Christmas, and they were like overly optimistic, and then Christmas came and they were still prisoners of war, and those people really suffered. I think some of them died because they just lost hope. But what the Stockdale paradox is a combination of two things, and it's basically a combination of facing up absolutely full on to the harsh reality of the day-to-day challenges that are in front of you, and absolutely taking those head on, and really being and that can be pretty painful and tough, and at the same time having confidence and faith that there's a better future some point into the future. There's a better place. And so having that combination of facing up to the brutal facts, as Jim Collins talks about it, and having a belief that if you face up to that brutal facts, you will get to a better place. That's how I was really trying to work with COVID. So we had some really, really tough challenges day in, day out. But we also had to believe that there was going to be, as there is now, a much better place. And I think that philosophy really helped me get through the COVID time.
Amazing. And could you identify perhaps over the years one mistake or misstep that has shaped your leadership approach?
Many, but many missteps. And I guess, when we're talking with colleagues or with students, it's important that we learn from those mistakes, and then they become very powerful. Probably the most powerful learning experiences are those mistakes we make. And I think when I think back over the last 14 years, the mistakes I've made, many of them would be in the communication territory. And I am absolutely fascinated and remain fascinated in both the science and the art of communication. And so my life got quite a lot better when I employed a full-time communications manager. And I still have regular meetings with my communications manager, and we learn a lot about how we communicate with the leadership team, with colleagues, with students, with the community, with the wider world. And I am absolutely fascinated because I think communication is so complex. There's always, but like teaching, there's always so much more you can learn about communication. And so I continue to read, to listen, to learn and practice different dimensions to communication. And I am a better communicator, I think, than I was 10 years ago, but I know I've still got a lot to learn.
Yeah, and it's extraordinary how much of a difference having a really great communications person or team alongside you is, with the pace at which things are changing these days, and with social media and, people's shrinking attention spans and what captures people's attention, in terms of how to connect with people and meet them where they are is a bit of an art form these days.
Oh, it is, absolutely. And I think a long time ago, I used to think it was good enough to have a really good idea, or really to have really good content. But I've learned now, through some pretty tough mistakes along the way, that however good your idea is, we need to think very carefully about how we package that and how we present that idea. And I think it's a fascinating area, and I love learning and trying to work different ways of packaging ideas so they actually land in the way that you want them to land.
So changing tack a little bit, as head of school, and you mentioned before COVID, lots of tough decisions almost on a daily basis that high impact decisions, whether it's finances, staffing, really tricky things. How do you handle that kind of ongoing tough decision making? Do you have a kind of a process or framework or things that underpin to make that sustainable for you?
That's a really good question. When I started my role here, I was very keen to do what Sir David Carter, who's a very experienced school leader in the UK. He talks about the first 100 days of headship. And he was adamant that in your first 100 days, you should try to listen to all your staff, as many parents as possible, as many students as possible, and get to understand the context that you're leading in, and then use that understanding to help shape your development plan. So what I learned very quickly was that leadership is a lot about listening. And it's interesting when you read books on leadership, Sir Alex Ferguson, the great Manchester United manager, the first chapter of his book is about listening. And so for me, listening to colleagues, to students, to parents, to governors, to what's going on out in the world, listening is a really important part of the decision-making process. When you can do that, you can't always do that. And so when I've got a tough decision to make, I'm really interested to look at the data. I mean, data's really important. I try to listen to as many different viewpoints as possible and also try to understand those viewpoints. So I think empathy is important. And then I think maybe the third bit, which is also important, and maybe I've come to trust a little bit more the more experience I've got, is also what feels right, and trusting your intuition. And if it doesn't feel right, then you can't always explain that, but then it's probably not right. But I think that combination of listening to understand, looking at the data, and then feeling whatever's inside you, what does your intuition tell you, and is it aligned, the decision, with actually where you're trying to go, and is it aligned with your North Star for you personally or for your organization?
Very good, very good. Is there a leadership practice or habit that has changed the game for you?
Well, as I've said, quite early on, I realized that listening was a key part of being a good leader. And then as a teacher before that, I think asking good questions and provoking thought. I still love provoking thought, provoking thinking by asking questions which really get people thinking. And so when I started to learn about coaching 10 years ago, I guess I first came across it. And then really what I think I've learned about coaching is that it's really about the essence. It's about asking good questions and also listening carefully to responses. And so when I was coaching, it's actually about helping us ask better questions and listen more intently and with greater understanding. I've really read and learned and practiced a lot about coaching. I've still got a long way to go. But I think that's really helped me develop as a leader and think very carefully about, when a colleague or a parent or a student comes to you with a problem, rather than trying to give them the answer and rescue them, actually trying to help them find the answer. It feels a lot better when you do that as a leader rather than just giving somebody the solution. So coaching is having a big impact on how I think and act as a leader.
And there's a quite a misconception for, at least in my experience anyway, with aspiring leaders or new leaders, in the assumption that to become a better leader, you have to have better answers. When in fact, the opposite is true, like you suggest. Having better questions is obviously quite often a much better approach in terms of knowing the right questions to ask and when to ask them, to really help, the rest of the team or the community or whoever it might be come to better understandings and solutions about things.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would say, I guess adding to that, or maybe saying that in a slightly different way, would be that when you become the head teacher or the principal or the CEO of an organization, it's much less about you, and it's more about how you help other people find the solutions to the problems they're facing. And coaching is a great way in which you can help people find the answers.
So our conversation has kind of drifted towards looking to the future a little bit now. Any advice you'd give to an aspiring school or education leader?
Well, I think we're in this volatile and stable world, very complex. And I go back actually to my very first meeting when I was a teacher. We had a departmental meeting. I had a great head of department, friend of mine called Howard Edwards. He was a great head of department. He was really inspirational, very influential for me back then. And we had this departmental meeting. After the meeting, he said, Kai, I just want to give some feedback from that meeting. He said, I think you need to be a little bit more flexible. Because I was like, no, we've got to do map work in year 7. We can't possibly do it in year 8, that sort of thing. He said, you just need to be a bit more flexible. And I think that has stayed with me, that first bit of feedback I got as a young teacher. That as a leader, I think flexibility. I then went on to learn a few years ago that flexibility. I think in the Taoism, it's seen as a great virtue, and it's sometimes seen as a weakness. But why is the palm tree? How does a palm tree survive the tropical storms? It survives the tropical storms because it's flexible, and so flexibility in that sense is actually a strength. And so that first bit of feedback I got might have been one of the most useful bits of feedback I ever had. Actually being flexible as a leader, and especially as we're in this rapidly changing world we are in now, I think organizations, school leaders, we need to be flexible if we're going to continue to thrive and do the best for our young people.
So, a couple of quick questions to wrap things up, Kai.
Okay.
Your favorite book on life or leadership?
My favorite book on leadership, I'd say in the last 5 years, without a doubt, Dare to Lead by Brené Brown. And I keep going back to it. I think it's a fantastic read. It's beautifully written, and it's given me lots to think about as I've been leading over the last few years.
One thing that you do daily that helps you to lead better?
Exercise. I try to exercise as much as I can, at least if I can every day. I try to exercise, and also that helps me sleep better, which definitely helps me be a better leader.
A leader, past or present, you admire?
Well, that's really hard. If I could be a bit subversive, and I'd say my first head teacher was a great leader, and he was just a really lovely guy, and he let me teach and lead as head of department in a wonderful way. My second head teacher I worked with was a different type of leader. He was a great opportunist, and he gave me so much experience of leading different aspects of a senior school, which at the time I found really tough. But he said to me, one day you'll look back on these experiences, you'll find it really useful. But I'd also have to mention, I've mentioned Sue Williamson, who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And she always saw the best in everybody. I thought it was wonderful. I also went with someone called Professor David Hargreaves at that time in SSAT. And he had a massive impact on me and still does. And how he's helped me think about what education could be like, big influence on me. So I know you asked for one, but I think those 4 people, my first 2 head teachers, and then Sue and David, they've all had a huge influence on how I think about education and leadership. And I feel really lucky that I've had the opportunity to work with such a different set of leaders, but those different leaders really helped me be the leader I am today, and I'm very grateful to all of them.
Amazing. And it's always so hard to just narrow it down to one person. So
It is.
All right. And finally, best advice you've ever received?
Well, the best advice, I think it would be, that bit about being flexible. I think that is a really useful piece of advice. And I think if I was sort of turning that around a little bit and saying, well, what advice would I give to somebody now as a school leader? I think the piece around, looking after yourself, and actually it starts with sleep. And the number of teachers and leaders I've met over the years who have had issues with sleep, including myself. So I think learning how to sleep well, that's really important. But I think the other bit is, and a head teacher explained this to me a long time ago. He says, as a leader, however good you are, you're always going to be dealing with issues. You're always going to have an in tray of problems. They're going to be coming at you. That's the reality of leadership. And so one way I've found, which he advocated, which really helps counter that, or as an antidote for that stress, is creating space to do creative parts of your job at least once a week, ideally a bit more. But make sure that as well as all the issues and challenges and problems that you're trying to solve, which can be very draining, you are also creating things, and that can help offset the pressure. And I think that was a really good piece of advice. And I probably only started acting on that maybe 2 or 3 years into my leadership journey as a head. The first few months I was just battered by this constant stream of problems, and then I actually found that when I started creating things and doing things in a creative way, that made a massive difference to how I felt about the role.
Amazing. Wonderful. Well, look, that's it. Thanks so much, Kai. Really appreciated you joining me today. It's been really fantastic to chat with you and hear your thoughts on a range of different topics. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Kevin, for inviting me on the show, and good luck with the Leadership Passport. Sounds like a great project. Sounds like a really creative project.
Great. Thanks, mate. Take care.
Take care. Cheers.
Thanks so much for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe, like, follow, etc. Drop a comment below to let me know anything you'd like covered in upcoming episodes or suggestions for future guests. You can also connect with me on Instagram and LinkedIn.